no good deed goes unpunished scenario, whereby we do something to uplift a distressed neighborhood only to discover that the end result is higher rents and a displacement of the people we were trying to help. We determined that land speculation was one of the sort of common causes of both the infrastructure conundrum and the no good deed goes unpunished problem, and that land value return and recycling might be a way to address it. In class 2, we talked about the mechanism by which land value return and recycling repairs the infrastructure conundrum and resolves the no good deed goes unpunished problem. In class 3, we compared land value return to other value capture techniques, such as development impact fees, tax increment financing, etc. And we talked about some of the similarities and differences between these different techniques and the different conditions that might make one appropriate at one time but not at another. Last week, we gave real-world examples of places where land value return and recycling has been utilized. And tonight, we're going to talk about the opportunities and challenges for implementing land value return and recycling. So this is the status quo, how land values are created and the consequence of doing so. Let me come up with the pointer here. Let's see. How do I? Okay. So now you see, I'm hoping you see my little pointer here. So this is the public. The public is paying taxes to the government. The government uses those taxes to create public goods and services, and they in turn create land values. Under the status quo, only a very tiny amount of land value created by the public sector trickles back through the property tax. The lion's share ends up going to landowners and primarily to a very few owners of prime sites. And what's interesting is that the status quo is really an engine for inequality. There's been a lot of talk about inequality these days, and this is one of the reasons why inequality exists. Basically, all the taxes paid by the general public end up basically creating wealth for very few people right here. And if people who've paid taxes want to take advantage of the infrastructure that their taxes have paid for, they have to pay a large rent premium to these owners of prime sites in order to get access. So we end up paying twice, maybe even 3 times if the developers demand tax abatements in order to develop. One of the things that's interesting about the tax abatements is that when the developers say, oh, we'd love to locate next to the new infrastructure, but we can't make money, so we need a tax abatement. Well, that's another time when the general public is paying. A lot of people think these tax abatements are subsidies to the developers, but in actuality, those are subsidies to the landowners, because that's what the tax abatement does, is it allows the developer to pay a high price for the land and still make money. And what we've proposed as an alternative, what we call land value return and recycling, can be seen as follows. Basically, a more robust share of publicly created land value gets returned to the public sector that created it. And as you can see, this creates a situation where public infrastructure is financially self-sustaining. If not completely, at least to a greater extent than it is today. And as a result, taxes on labor and capital can be reduced, which makes the economy more robust and leads to greater employment, which is very important, particularly now. And because land values are being returned to the public sector, land prices do not get inflated, which means that once the public has paid for infrastructure, they can access it with a lower rent premium, just to compare the status quo with what we're proposing as a remedy. And finally, a lot of people have heard about the crisis of housing affordability. This chart tracks the consumer price index and building costs, meaning material costs, wages, and land prices over time. And here we see the consumer price index. And indeed, the cost of materials, the solid line here, and the dotted line, wages, appear to be above the consumer price index. And a lot of people think that's why housing is so expensive, because materials and labor. But when you look at it closely and you look at what's happened to land prices, this is what happened to land prices through 1980. And so really our affordable housing crisis is more an affordable land crisis than it is anything else. So what are the opportunities and challenges for implementing land value return and recycling? Well, the first opportunity is that communities are desperate for infrastructure funding. So given that, can state and local governments continue to give away enormous amounts of publicly created land value as they do now? I don't think so. But many of them are unaware of the extent to which they're just giving value away. And land value return and recycling, as we just mentioned, can help make infrastructure financially self-sustaining. So that's clearly an opportunity. Also, sprawl is a big problem. Sprawl creates environmental harms. It sort of locks us into private automobiles, which consume lots of energy and contribute to global warming. They produce air pollution from exhaust. Our single-family homes waste a lot of energy. That produces pollution at the power plants. And the amount of impervious surface, both in terms of rooftops and streets and parking lots, is expanded, and that creates enormous amounts of water pollution, especially through stormwater runoff. So sprawl is terribly damaging to the environment, and it's also very expensive, because if we have 10 people living along 1 mile of road versus 10 people living along 10 miles of road, obviously, if we have 10 people living along 10 miles of road, the cost of the infrastructure per capita is that much more expensive. So land value return and recycling, by reducing sprawl and encouraging development where land values are high, which is within already urbanized areas, helps us take advantage of existing infrastructure, reduces environmental damage, and allows us to facilitate development with less infrastructure and thereby with lower taxes. And in the rural and exurban areas, development impact fees and exactions can help steer development away from areas that are more appropriate for agricultural, conservation, or recreation uses. And finally, as we talked about earlier, land value return and recycling provides a solution to the no good deed goes unpunished problem. So many people today have seen situations where attempts to improve a neighborhood of distressed people ends up resulting in higher rents, displacing the distressed families, and enriching landlords at public expense. And a lot of people simply throw up their hands, become cynical, and decide, well, it just goes to show there's really nothing we can do. But what we've shown is that this doesn't have to happen. There's a mechanism that causes it to happen, and it's the ability of private landowners to appropriate publicly created land value. That's the fuel for land speculation, and that's the key factor in the no good deed goes unpunished scenario. Returning land values to the public sector that created it removes the fuel from land speculation and allows the benefits of public improvements to be retained by the public. Now, another opportunity is the fact that communities are already doing it. Most jurisdictions, almost all, employ a traditional property tax, which is levied both against the privately created building values and against publicly created land values. To the extent that most communities are already levying a tax against land value, most communities today are practicing some degree of land value return and recycling. Simply by gradually shifting the property tax off of building values and onto land values, this incremental change can have profound and beneficial effects. So that's also an opportunity. to make incremental change with profound beneficial effects over time. Now, of course, there are challenges, and we'll just list a few. First and foremost, very few people understand the difference of the impact between taxing land values and taxing building values or improvement values. Secondly, many communities lack state legislation to permit the imposition of different tax rates on land values and building values. And finally, some states actually have laws that prohibit this. So both in the second and third cases above here, we need new state law or an amendment or repeal of existing law. So that's a challenge. And finally, or I shouldn't say finally, but additionally, there's a disconnect in terms of governmental coordination. Many infrastructure projects are selected and funded by state and federal governments, but land use controls and property taxes are typically controlled by local governments. So in order to overcome the disconnect between infrastructure and land use, we need better coordination between all different levels of government. And finally, many people don't understand the language we use to talk about this reform. Some of you may have heard about value capture, but most people have never heard the term and don't understand it. I don't think it's intuitive, and the United Nations abandoned this term because they felt that the word capture sounded aggressive and hostile. And how perhaps overcome those objections. First off, people will say, well, what's wrong with property tax? And the answer, I think quite simple, is that it's upside down. It punishes people who provide housing and jobs while rewarding people who hoard land, keeping it vacant, or who allow buildings to deteriorate. And then in response to that, people will say, well, if this property tax is so bad, why not eliminate it? And the answer to that objection is that part of the property tax merely returns to the public land value that the public sector created in the first place. And allowing publicly created land value to become a windfall to private landowners encourages land speculation, a parasitic activity that increases rents and destroys jobs and affordable housing. And then finally, people will say, well, if this is such a good idea, where is it done? And as we said just moments ago, in actuality, land value return is done almost everywhere that there's a traditional property tax. But it's just too minimal to accomplish its objectives, and it's overshadowed by the adverse impacts from taxing privately created building values. Vocabulary is very important. As everybody knows, it's hard to change the status quo. So what we want to make sure is that as we go forward and try to enact change, we don't create additional and unnecessary hurdles for ourselves. Some people who are familiar with this concept have gone to public meetings where people will talk about problems related to sprawl or affordable housing or a lack of jobs. And they'll pipe up during the meeting and say, hey, we can solve our problem with a land value tax. And all the people in the audience hear is the word tax. And their response is, well, thank you very much, but we don't need a new tax. And as you might imagine, oftentimes they're very much less polite than that in terms of their response. Perhaps a better approach might be to say that we could make improvements by enacting a universal tax abatement act. This is in actuality the same thing, except instead of emphasizing that we're taxing land values, we're emphasizing that we're reducing the tax on all buildings. And that's on all buildings, not just on a favored few, as is typical with most tax abatements. And I want to tip my hat to Josh Vincent at the Center for the Study of Economics, because He's the person who I first heard use the concept of a universal tax abatement. And I just thought it was a brilliant way of talking about this in a way that will make people much more favorable to the concept. Corrine, if you could mute your mic, that would be great.
Sorry.
Yeah. And of course, then people say, well, what's the concept behind the Universal Abatement Act? And it's at that point when we can talk about land value return. And land value return scores better with focus groups than either land value recovery, land value capture, or land value sharing. Land value tax wasn't tested, but probably would get an even worse reception than the others. So this is a focus group, I think, that was done by the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. And you'll see here on the left, this is how the public focus group reacted to the term land value return. 52% said it sounded like a good idea, 34% were neutral, and 14% said it sounded like a bad idea. But compare that to land value sharing, where people opposed were 34%, people in favor 35%, no opinion 31%. So, and land value capture didn't do much better. So land value return gets more favorable and fewer unfavorable responses. And although a lot of us like to think that we're logical and rational beings, most of us in actuality are very emotional about how we make our decisions. So it's important to be aware that words trigger emotional reactions and that we use words that trigger positive emotional responses. Of course, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, we have to understand how the traditional property tax works. And basically, as most of you know, the building assessment and the land assessment are added together. That is multiplied by a rate, and that results in your tax. Using the universal tax abatement, which others might refer to as a split rate property tax or as a land value tax, but which I'll call a universal tax abatement, we do two calculations separately. First, the building assessment is multiplied by a building rate, and the land assessment is multiplied by the land rate. You add the two together to come up with the tax. And as we've talked about before, if we make the switch from taxing land and buildings at the same rate, and then suddenly go to a situation where we tax land very high and buildings either not at all or at a very low rate, that sudden change will create windfalls and wipeouts, which first will be unfair, and second will create a lot of political opposition. So the key concept behind making this change palatable politically is to phase it in gradually over a period of time. And so what we do is over time, the building rate will get smaller and the land rate will get larger, but that will happen gradually over time. Now, again, there will be objections. Some people will say, well, you know, it's not possible to assess land values and building values separately, particularly because most properties have both land and building combined. And how do you know how much of the total value belongs to the building and how much belongs to land? Well, we talked about this either last week or the week before, and we mentioned that average folks do this every day when they're buying a house or renting an apartment. They see similar apartments or homes in different neighborhoods with different prices. And they intuitively understand that certainly the structure, the apartment or the home is just about the same in these different neighborhoods that they're looking at, and that the real difference in price is related to differences in neighborhood, which are different land prices. Now, our assessors have access to computer-assisted mass appraisal or CAMA systems, and it's more important that assessments are fair than that they be absolutely accurate. And finally, If the assessors need help, the International Association of Assessing Officers, the IAAO, can provide assistance in this regard. So what are the key steps to implementing land value return? First, we have to determine if a project will create significant benefits in a defined area. Now that defined area, like a transit stop, might be right around the transit station, or if we're thinking of a transit system, it might be an entire jurisdiction or even multiple jurisdictions. And as we were just discussing, we have to figure out, okay, so there's a defined area. What is that defined area? What is the scale or boundary where benefits are achieved? And then we have to estimate how much land value will be created as a result of the project. Then we have to figure out what's the legal environment? How do we collect the land value that we create? And in some cases, there might be multi-jurisdictional and interagency coordination that's required. And finally, administrative resources and institutional capacities will have to be established or outsourced. So let's, again, think about a campaign in a particular jurisdiction. How do we move toward implementing land value return? Well, first, it's very important to know why we're doing it. We might want to do it to establish more equitable and sustainable, a more sustainable and equitable economy. We might want to make infrastructure more financially self-sustaining. We might want to obtain fair compensation from the people who benefit from our infrastructure investments. And we might want to create a better integration between infrastructure projects and land use policies in order to reduce sprawl and environmental damage, reduce traffic congestion, reduce wasteful infrastructure duplication, and reduce total tax burdens. And finally, we might want to do this to maximize housing affordability and job creation. So whenever we set out to do something, we need to be clear about why we're doing it. And then the next thing, and we mentioned this before, is we need to understand the legal environment we're operating in. So we have to identify both state and local laws that either permit or prohibit land value return and recycling. The next thing to do, once we know what we're up against, is to identify stakeholders and develop outreach campaigns appropriate for each group. And stakeholders could include groups that are working on affordable housing. And in particular, some groups are promoting community land trusts. Well, community land trusts are based on the same philosophy as land value return and recycling. So there's a natural affinity there. Anti-poverty, job creation, economic development, and labor groups are an obvious stakeholder group. And when we think about anti-poverty, and again about inequality, particularly as it relates to race in this country, some people no doubt have recently seen that the average Black household only makes 60% of the income of the average white household. But when it comes to wealth, the average Black household has only 10% of the average white household wealth. And why is that? That's because African Americans have systematically been discriminated against in terms of housing and property ownership. And that's had a tremendous adverse effect on their economic status. We were talking about sprawl as a big problem that land value return can help overcome. So environmental groups are a logical source of support for land value return and recycling. And of course, there are social justice and religious groups that think that it's very important to have ethical economics. And I do think that land value return and recycling is an example of ethical economics. And so the thing, once we've identified stakeholder groups in our communities, we need to create a coalition who's willing to, put their time and energy into creating land value return and recycling. So in addition to talking about organizations and communities, I also talk about agencies. And I put a little asterisk there because a public agency, like your economic development agency or your Department of Housing and Community Development, your Office of Planning, they might not be able to lobby for legislation. But if we propose legislation, they will certainly be interviewed by the press or consulted by the mayor or the city council and asked what they think about it. So before that happens, it behooves us to discover what their concerns are and respond to them. Hopefully they'd be favorably disposed. But even if we can simply prevent them from opposing land value return, that's a positive outcome. Now, this is an example from Washington, D.C. In the late 1980s, a group was put together to promote land value return and recycling. And this is just a sample of some of the groups and individuals who endorsed the campaign. You can see there's the Coalition of Economic Development Organizations, the Center City Community Corporation, the Statehood Party, Committee to Save Rental Housing, the Housing Action Coalition, ACORN, Greater Washington Mutual Housing, on and on. These are all housing groups. Here we have individuals who are activists, who are known and influential. Here we have labor leaders. Jocelyn Williams was the president of the Washington Central Labor Council. Harry Chambers with the local operating engineers, and Ed Cornegie with the Teamsters. Again, more prominent local officials. Same here. Here we had thought leaders like Anthony Downs from Brookings, Stephen Fuller, Ernest Cooper, who was with the planning department at the University of the District of Columbia, Professor Rodney Green from Howard University, Jerome Page, an economist, Wilhelmina Lee, who's an economist. And then we have church leaders down here. And here we have leaders, elected community leaders from advisory neighborhood commissions. So that's just an example of a coalition that was put together. You'll come up with one that's appropriate for your community. But once you've identified a coalition and gotten them together, that's not enough. You need a champion. Typically, you need at least one elected official who's willing to introduce the legislation and go to bat for it. And then behind that one elected official, you need civic and religious leaders like the heads of the organizations who endorsed the idea on the previous page. So that's key. And that's the one thing I think that was lacking in the District of Columbia campaign of the late 80s and early 90s was we did not have an elected official to serve as a champion. And that really set us back. The next thing you want to do before this hits the headlines is educate the media about it. Because people in the media, they're just regular folks. And if they don't understand land value return and recycling, when they're asked to report about it, their biases or misunderstandings are going to get embedded in the story. And once misinformation gets spread, it's very hard to get rid of it. So before the bill is introduced, before there's a real campaign, very quietly, you can begin to educate the media by having meetings with editorial boards and with reporters who cover either issues related to taxation or transportation or infrastructure or planning. Say, you might want to be aware of this policy that's been used successfully in other communities around the country and elsewhere around the world. And if they say, well, why should I waste my time on this? You say, well, we think that there might be a campaign about this in the future, but we wanted to sort of give you a heads up. And that, if you have a good, catchy presentation, should catch their interest. Once you've got your champions, your coalition, and you've educated the media, then it's time to go out to the public. And at that point, you can start lobbying for the permissive legislation that you'll need at the state level. And if you're successful there, then you turn your focus on either a city or a county government, because that's typically where implementing legislation will occur. So in addition to this sort of legislative focus, there's also a new focus required for agencies, particularly agencies that are involved with planning and zoning and infrastructure. So the old approach for these agencies is to do engineering studies to determine what the demand is for infrastructure and where it should best be located. Then they try to obtain grants from federal and state budgets, and then they build it, and then they're on to the next project. That's the old approach. The new approach starts out the same. Yes, they need to do their engineering studies to determine where and when public infrastructure is needed. But then things get different. We have to assess how much land value is going to be created as a result, and understand the different incentives associated with different funding techniques. And we discussed this a few weeks ago when we compared funding infrastructure with a development impact fee versus funding it with land value return. So funding it with development impact fee actually discouraged development, whereas funding it with land value return encouraged development. And depending on whether we're in a rural area or an urban area, that may determine which of these techniques is appropriate. Do we want to encourage development or discourage development? And land value return, where it's determined to be appropriate, should be mandatory. I mean, you can't just ask people to voluntarily give it up, because they won't. And if it's not required by law, then this is where the new approach and the new attitude gets real interesting. Because at that point, agencies need to negotiate with landowners and indicate that this new infrastructure is going to be provided, but only if and when the landowners agree to provide land value return in exchange. In other words, it's a transaction. And this is similar to what happened when we did that infill metro rail station that I talked about last week. There was no law in the books that required landowners to pay for new infrastructure. But I told the landowners when they asked for the station that the city didn't have the money, and we knew that their land value was going to go up as a result. So if they wanted the infrastructure, they were going to have to pay for it. And indeed, they did come up with money, although they didn't come back to me. They went around to the mayor's office, so that, knowing that the mayor's office wouldn't bargain as hard as I would. But in any event, that's a very different approach to providing and funding infrastructure than we have right now. And that, changing culture is hard to do. But I really think we have to spend time with our planning and infrastructure agencies to tell them that they've got to stop just giving land value away and only create infrastructure or increase zoning permission if the city is going to get something in return. And we have to learn how to drive a hard bargain. And then finally, part of that new approach is establishing intergovernmental coordination regarding land use objectives and controls, project selection and funding, and land value return. And finally, I've said it before, I'll say it again, and I'm sure I'll say it again during our Q&A session. We have to be very careful with language. Our language should be comprehensible and positive. Oftentimes, the language we use, especially for those of us who have studied this topic a lot, and you may know from your own area of expertise, you go to school and with blood, sweat, and tears, you learn the jargon of your discipline. And once you've graduated, you want people to know how much you've suffered for your degree. So you go out to public meetings and start spewing your jargon. And you might get two reactions. Somebody might say, boy, that guy must be smart. I didn't understand a thing he said. Well, okay, so you've impressed somebody, but you're not winning hearts and minds. And as we've learned lately, a lot of people won't say, oh, you must be very smart. Their reaction might be totally negative, which is, that guy's an elitist. He's not talking, he's talking down to us and not helping us understand what he's talking about. And they just dismiss you as being an elitist. So it's very important, however much jargon we've learned, is that we explain our concepts in everyday language and use stories that people can relate to. And I think the following terms are easy to understand. Most people understand user fees, like the per gallon fee you pay for water, a toll you pay on the highway, what you pay at a parking meter. These types of fees people understand, and there's a certain fairness that you pay for what you get. That seems to have resonate pretty positively with most people. Then the concept which relates to land value return is something that people haven't heard of before, which is the infrastructure access fee. And you'll remember that that's the term we used when we were talking about whether somebody with a vacant lot should pay anything to the Water and Sewer Authority. And we determined that even though the owner of a vacant lot wasn't drinking water or flushing toilets, if they had water and sewer pipes at the property boundary, their property was more valuable as a result. So they should pay the Water and Sewer Authority an infrastructure access fee. And what is infrastructure access fee? Well, that's land value return and recycling. The Water and Sewer Authority is creating land value. We're simply returning that value to the Water and Sewer Authority that created it, or the Transit Authority, or the school district, or whoever is creating value at a particular place. The development impact fee, I think, is pretty easy to understand if it's explained clearly. And again, we indicated that's primarily makes sense in rural, exurban, or even suburban places where infrastructure has been maxed out. And you don't want developers to take advantage of cheap land value and then be subsidized by everybody else when they have to build new infrastructure to accommodate it. So a development impact fee in areas that lack infrastructure is a fair way to level the playing field between rural areas and urban areas, and to avoid premature development of the rural area, and to avoid the public subsidization of private profits at that development. And then if we want to create what are typically called special assessment districts, well, a special assessment district, the acronym for that is SAD or SAD. Well, that again is not very considerate if we're thinking about how people are going to relate to the acronym. So better than a special assessment district, although exactly the same in terms of how it's structured, would be something like a transportation improvement district or a benefit improvement district. They have much friendlier sounding acronyms. So again, at every level, we need to be careful with language. And at this point, I'd like to open up for questions. Ibrahima, do we have anybody lined up at this point?
I don't see any questions, but I guess we can unmute everyone and then start taking questions.
Well, tell you what, while people are thinking about questions, I've prepared some of my own questions. So I'll some
Very
of my
good.
questions first, and then as people are thinking, we can let them chime in. So the first thing that a lot of people ask is this shift equitable? And empirical evidence shows that middle and low-income neighborhoods oftentimes benefit the most from land value return and recycling. And it's interesting because if you ask people off the cuff, who do you think would benefit from reducing the tax on building values? People might think, oh, it's going to benefit the rich people because they have the fanciest buildings. What people fail to realize is that land values in rich neighborhoods are a much higher percentage of total property value than in poor neighborhoods. So as a result, switching the tax off of buildings and onto land actually helps middle and low income neighborhoods more than the wealthy neighborhoods. So in the wealthy neighborhoods, the homes are fancy, but the land is even fancier still and a greater percentage of total property value. So this is a progressive shift in most cases. And I want to just show evidence of an analysis that I did in Washington, D.C. Again, this is referencing a campaign that we produced in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about a study that we did in 1991 when the City Council was trying to adopt tax rates, property tax rates for 1992. And I based this study on actual property assessments that I got from the assessor's office from 1990. So prior to 1990, the District of Columbia had 4 classes of real property. Owner-occupied residential property, that's homeowner property. Non-owner-occupied residential property, that's rental property. Hotel, motel, and then class 4 was everything else. So commercial and industrial property. In 1991, the City Council enacted a penalty tax on vacant property, which was vacant land and unoccupied buildings. And as you can see, these were the tax rates in 1991 that were being proposed for 1992. So for homeowners, the tax rate was 96 cents per $100. For rental property, $1.54. Hotel motel was $1.85. $2.15 for commercial property. And then this penalty tax on vacant property was $5. And what we did was we thought, well, let's look at a hypothetical split rate tax or land value return. And what we did was we took this existing tax rate as sort of a midpoint. So what we did was we reduced the tax on buildings to 65 and then made the land portion double that, so $1.30. For rental property, we made the building tax 95 cents and the land tax $1.90. For hotel motel, $1.25 on the building, $2.50 on the land. And then for commercial property, $1.45 on the building and $1.90 on the land. And then for land that was totally vacant, we proposed, instead of what the council was proposing, we would just impose a penalty tax on vacant land only. And that, by the way, would include surface parking lots, which were exempted for reasons I don't understand from the council's penalty tax. We proposed a lower rate of $3.29, and all of this was done to raise the same tax revenue under both systems. Now, the District of Columbia has 56 assessment neighborhoods. So here I have each assessment neighborhood listed, the ward that it's in. So we have 8 political wards, and then the number of properties in each neighborhood, the total land assessment, the total building assessment in each assessment neighborhood, the total assessment, land as a percentage of total, and then I have 3 different tax calculations. One is the 1990 assessments times the calculated rate, and the calculated rate adjusts the prior year's rate, the 1991 rate, and if property assessments were going up faster than inflation, then the calculated rate reduces automatically. The second iteration was simply to keep the 1991 tax rates the same. This is what the council. And then the third option was our hypothetical rate. Somebody has their mic open and it's creating noise. Can you mute yourself? Thank you. And then in this column, we show the difference. And I don't know about most of you. Of course, so this was done for class 1. This is all owner-occupied property for all 56 neighborhoods. And then we did the same thing for vacant class 1 property. And here you see that the percentages of increases are the same, simply because in a revenue neutral exercise, the amount of tax increase or reduction is dependent on the ratio of building value to land value. And if land is vacant, that ratio is constant. So that's why all these are the same. So this is the summary of what we found out. So here were the 1991 tax rates here, the 4 classes of property, plus the 5th rate down here, vacant land. And these were our hypothetical rates. And for all of class 1, there was a 12% reduction compared to the 1991 tax rates. But vacant property within the class 1 category went up by 35%. Of course, what you'll notice is that there are approximately 68,000 homeowner properties that are improved and only 570 that are vacant. So very few of these properties. Then in rental properties, again, we analyzed the impact on improved properties, an 18% reduction citywide, and a 23% increase on vacant properties. And I should note that you'll notice that I'm analyzing improved properties and vacant properties separately. And the reason for that is that when I'm applying this transition to improved properties, oftentimes their taxes go down. But when I apply a land value return to a vacant property, the tax goes up. So if I lump them all together, we would miss it. And if there was a neighborhood that had a lot of vacant properties, it would just show that the tax liability for that neighborhood was going up, even though homeowners might be getting a break and rental properties might be getting a break. So it's important that we not lump improved properties and vacant properties together, because the impact of the change goes in opposite directions. And we want to make that clear to the politicians. So here again, we notice for hotel, motel, notice we have very few of these properties, only 147 improved and 23 vacant hotel, motel properties. So they had a -3 change in tax liability. That's basically a wash. And class 4 improved property only went up 3%, but vacant class 4 property, that's the land that we applied the 329 rate to, this higher rate here, and that provided a 53% increase. You'll notice that the 1991 rates raised $639 million. And the hypothetical rates of land value return raised 644. So I raised just a little bit more here than here. And why did I do that? Because I didn't want anybody to say that these tax reductions were just achieved by reducing the amount of tax collected. So I wanted to avoid any misunderstanding there. And this is, again, just a clearer summary of what was happening. And you've looked at these tables, and if you're like me, if I see those lists of assessment neighborhoods and columns of numbers, my eyes glaze over. And the politicians might find this interesting, these citywide results, but a lot of politicians are elected by ward, and they'll want to know, well, what's happening in my ward, in my neighborhood? And so what I did was I took that data that was in columns and I put it onto a map. Now, this is a map of Washington, D.C. It's a little disorienting because north is in this direction, sort of diagonal. This is 16th Street right here. This is where the White House is. This is the Capitol, this is the mall, this is the Lincoln Memorial here. So this is north in this direction. This is Rock Creek Park, right through here. And this area, whoops, I just lost my, I don't know why I lost my spotlight. Well, I hope you'll bear with me. I don't seem to be able to.
We can still see the cursor though.
Okay, let me see if I can get it back now.
Yeah.
Here we go. So this area west of Rock Creek Park is very affluent, very affluent. This area in the center of the city is more middle class and working class. And this is the Anacostia River. And this area east of the river is working class and very low income. So that gives you a sense of the area. And as I mentioned, or as you remember, these were the tables we started with. And you know, how do you make sense of that? So I transferred this data onto the map. And I used different shades of gray. The darker shades show a higher percentage of tax reduction. So the darkest area showed areas where the property tax burden was reduced by 20% or more. And what we see for homeowner property is that the greatest reductions occur in the low-income neighborhoods, and medium reductions in the middle class, and the least reduction occurs in the affluent area. But there's still reductions over here. And I should, just to let you know, this is the second iteration of the study I did. The first iteration I did, and you'll notice up here I talk about the methodology, 1990 assessments minus the homestead deduction. So not only do homeowner properties get a low rate, which is 96 cents per hundred, but there's also what's called a homestead deduction. And I forget what it was at that time. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say it was $30,000. So in 1990, if your a homeowner property was assessed at $100,000, they'd subtract $30,000 from the assessment. And this 96 cents tax rate was only applied to $70,000. So when I was doing this land value return and having a different rate on land and buildings, I had a choice about how to deduct the homestead deduction. And what I did the first time was I deducted it entirely off of land value. And the reason I did that was because it was most beneficial to poor people. And there was a problem with that. The problem was when I deducted the homestead deduction entirely from land value, some of the property tax reductions in these areas of the city were 80 and 90%. And then over in the affluent areas, there were tax increases of about 4 to 7%, which I did not think was bad because, you know, first I was a young guy in my 20s, and I was thinking, well, gee, in a regular year, their assessments go up by that much anyway, so it's not a big deal. Well, I was wrong on both accounts. First, when I went to community meetings and said, hi, I'd like to talk about this policy that can reduce your tax liability by 80 to 90%, a lot of people in the meeting thought I was a snake oil salesman. They just didn't believe that. And then, because the tax liability would go up even slightly over here, there was a law firm that handled property assessment appeals. They did not like, they also supported a lot of land speculators. They sent anonymous letters to people who lived in this area. I was working for a member of the city council, and they said, council member so-and-so is going to raise your taxes. So that was a big mistake that I learned from. So when I did this iteration in 1991, I took the homestead deduction equally from the building and the land. And as a result, it gave a small benefit to the affluent neighborhood. That way, I wasn't raising any homeowner taxes because that would be the kiss of death politically. And by making the tax reductions a little less generous in the poor neighborhoods, it seemed more realistic. So, and more believable. So this was the impact, again, for homeowner properties. This is the impact for rental property, class 2. You'll see that the reductions are more uniform. And the reason for that is that a lot of rental buildings are either townhomes or apartment buildings. They have a higher building to land ratio than single family homes. So they fare better under a split rate approach typically than single family homes. And then even in the affluent neighborhoods over here, we have some high-rise apartments. And some of you may think, well, why reduce the taxes on the super wealthy? But the thing to remember here is that the cost of infrastructure is related to distance. And the lack of affordable housing is related to how many people can share infrastructure. So if rich people are living in apartment buildings where a lot of people can share small pieces of land, we should encourage that and provide more room for people to live in our city. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that affluent people got a tax break where they were using very little land and being very efficient in their use of public infrastructure. But again, the biggest reductions were here in the low-income neighborhoods. I did not do a map for hotel motel, which was class 3. As I mentioned before, there were only 140, 150 properties like that in the city. So it's just misleading to create a map of how the effects get spread out because there are just so few properties. But I did map class 4 properties. And what's interesting is it showed a small increase, 4 to 7%. This is the downtown and West End areas of Washington, D.C. And this is the Connecticut Avenue and Wisconsin Avenue corridor. Again, a very swanky area, both for offices and for shops. And so they got some very minor increases here. But, and it's interesting to note that when the classification system was first enacted, you'll notice that this tax rate that the city was charging, $2.15 per hundred, much higher than the residential rates of either 96 cents or $1.54. Well, that's because the city council was thinking, well, let's get the commercial properties to pay and save the homeowners. And when they're thinking about commercial properties, they're thinking about the big office buildings downtown. But they're forgetting that the little mom and pop stores in the neighborhoods, they're also class 4. And so I was very pleased to see that the neighborhood commercial businesses and industrial firms got tax reductions under land value return and recycling. I thought that was very important. Why? Because the neighborhood commercial area helps make these neighborhoods livable. The fact that I can walk to the corner store to get groceries or buy shoes, that creates livability in my city and in my neighborhood. And these mom and pop stores are often great sources of employment, both for young people and for people who decide they're not attorneys or consultants or accountants, as is typical for many other employees in DC. So these firms employ district residents, and it's very important that they do well because they're under a lot of stress economically. So I just wanted to go through that because I knew, I think the last time Dennis Strait from Kansas City had asked, well, what's the impact of this switch on a typical family home in Kansas City? And so here I can't answer Dennis's question, but I can show how you would analyze it because we did analyze it for Washington, D.C. And by now, Ibrahima, I would imagine you do have some people lined up for questions.
Yes,
So,
I do. I have a long list here. Alex?
Yep. Hi, Rick. Thanks. Another Annapolis-based question for you. So as people may know, we have a city dock that's right on the water that is experiencing a lot of nuisance flooding, and there's an effort underway now to mitigate that flooding, and they're, of course it's going to be expensive, so they're looking at all kinds of different ways, the sort of traditional ways of funding it, most notably creating what they call a resiliency financing authority that's going to issue bonds, and then they're going to try to service those bonds through increase in hotel tax, all that kind of sort of, I think of as sort of magic financing.
Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree.
Exactly. So, that's one of these examples I started thinking about value capture land value return and recycling. And
right.
So here's an example where there are just actually a few owners that are really going to benefit. They have property that essentially abuts where all of this flooding mitigation will take place.
That's right.
And that is going to, that mitigation is going to impart huge amounts of value, because that property is essentially worthless without this mitigation, because it's, it's underwater, it's under a foot of water now, 60 days a year.
That's correct.
And so I see what they're doing now as basically a complete giveaway.
It's what we've talked about before, which is they're getting the general public to subsidize wealth for a very few people.
Right. So here's I'm
inequality. Yes.
I am eventually leading up to a question here, but
okay.
So in thinking about LVRR, and there's sort of two sides of that equation. So we change policies such that they will make better use, higher and best use of that land. So on the other side of that equation is here's really the question is, we have to let them get more value from that land if we're going to essentially incentivize them to do it. And so here's where the rub is it's part of a historic district.
Right.
That the public, the legislators, everybody is very anti-development. They don't, especially when it comes to height.
Right.
So, anything that's above 35 feet or whatever the zoning is now is like a non-starter. So they're basically artificially limiting the intensity that can happen there. So as a landowner, you might say, okay, you're going to incentivize me to get more value out of this land, but then you're not going to let me do it. So I guess the question is, you have to, if you're gonna play that game, you have to. So
you're basically asking, is this a catch-22 where we're taxing people based on something that we're not allowing them to do?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think there's an answer to that question. First of all, the value of land includes or is based upon what people are allowed to do with it and where that intersects with the market. So for example, we could zone a piece of Iowa farmland for a 100-story skyscraper, right? Now in Manhattan, a 100-story skyscraper would have a huge market value if you had an acre of land that you could put 100 stories on. Be hugely valuable in Manhattan. But there's no demand for office space in the middle of Iowa. So if you take that cornfield and zone it for a 100-story building, the land value isn't going to change, right? The demand for that land is based on how much corn it'll produce. And that's it, regardless of how you zone it. On the other hand, if you take a place that has a demand for a 100-story building and you zone it for 10 stories, the value of that land is going to reflect the income that could be produced from a 10-story building. Even though there might be demand for 100 stories, you're not allowed to do that. So the land value doesn't reflect unfettered market demand. It reflects market demand as constrained by development regulations, including zoning. So getting back to Annapolis, you have a historic district where development is severely constrained. Now, let's say right now you're allowed to develop 35 feet from street level. Maybe that's 3 stories, and you're not allowed to change the facade of any historic building, etc. Now, today, so that's your base. In other words, nobody's going to pay more for that land than a 3-story historic building can generate in terms of revenue, okay? But now, let's realize that this 3-story historic building, as you say, is flooding 60 days a year. Well, there are all kinds of expenses associated with that. A, higher insurance, if you can get it. Maybe you can't get insurance because it floods. And every time it floods, you've got enormous cleanup costs, right? So even though your 3-story historic building is producing revenue, the revenue you keep, your net revenue, is going down because of all this flooding. So if we reduce the flooding risk, we're going to raise the revenue you keep because you're going to get rid of the cleanup costs, your insurance premiums go down, etc. So we are creating value by reducing the flooding. Now, here's an interesting question, which I cannot answer. Does the cost of flood mitigation, how does that cost relate to the benefits we're creating? And you might say, well, if the benefits don't, are less than the cost, maybe it's not worth doing. And that's an interesting empirical question. But that question really doesn't even get asked if we're going to just ask all the general public throughout the city or county to pay for this infrastructure that's going to benefit a few owners. So I think you start with saying, there's a fundamental fairness issue. We're going to reduce some problems for a few owners, which is a good thing. But if we're going to do that, the people who get the benefit should pay the cost. And if they're not willing to pay the cost, then maybe it's not worth doing.
A lot of arguments are made on that the general public is benefiting because of what it brings to the character of the town, for example. I know that's hard to quantify, but
here's my answer to that. Yes, the entire city benefits from the historic district, but that's a given. And these properties today are generating revenue based on the tourism and all those other things that happen. So that's part of your baseline. The only thing that's different is that property owners who are subject to flooding have additional expenditures. I mean, maybe when there's flooding, maybe they can't have customers or patrons if they're a hotel. So maybe it does raise their revenue slightly, but primarily it just reduces their cost.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Is basically it prevents access to conduct business.
So we're not really, I mean, if we're generating an additional revenue for the entire city, I'd be surprised. I mean, the historic district is there, it's generating tourism. That tourism is there whether there's flooding or not. It may get redistributed a little bit away from the flood zone, but again, the determination will be, is the value created for those properties that are now subject to flooding enough to justify the expense of preventing that flooding? And you may remember, I guess it was last week when we talked about examples, I talked about the Miami Conservancy District. The Miami River in Ohio, which runs through Dayton, flooded regularly, and some of them were catastrophic, tremendous loss of life as well as property. And they hired Arthur Morgan to engineer a series of dry dams to control those floods. And the way they paid for the Conservancy District was that properties that were no longer subject to flood were now much more valuable, both for farming and for urban uses. And so it was that uplift of property value that more than paid for the dams, and did it fairly because the people who benefited paid the cost. So I would use the Miami Conservancy District as a very sort of on-point example for your Annapolis situation.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Ibrahima, who's next?
Yes, Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I had several questions. I'm wondering which one I should ask first, but um, I was kind of curious about how that trial system that you had developed, was that a report on something that actually was proposed and voted favorably?
Unfortunately not. Um, we did develop this pro-housing property tax coalition, which I showed the endorsement list of. But what we lacked was a political champion.
Okay.
We did not have, even though the woman I worked for on the city council was marginally supportive, she was at a point in her career where she wasn't able to effectively articulate what was behind this reform, and she was not willing to advocate for it as a result.
Okay. Yeah.
So it lacked a champion. And what happened was that instead of land value return, the city implemented a penalty tax on vacant property. And I think either last week or the week before, I mentioned that resulted in a lot of problems. First of all, very little money was collected. It was administratively impossible. And there were a lot of unintended consequences, like the arson rate went up by 400%.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
okay, so that was I just want some clarity on that. But
yeah, so that was an unsuccessful campaign.
Yeah. So I'm thinking now with the prevalent protests that are going on, that perhaps the way that we sell the idea of a land value tax, maybe we've been going down the wrong road. So maybe the language, which you say is so important, should be something such like the land value return is a system that renters especially would love. So, the people who are into social justice would reflect and say, yeah, I'm a renter. So yeah, what more can you tell me about that? So I don't know if that's a campaign tactic, but it seems that there's a lot of people in motion for social justice, and here we have a social justice system that we haven't been able to gain a lot of traction with. So would you?
Well, I think that goes back to what I said earlier, which is, first of all, just you're right. Yes, the answer is yes. But when every community is different. Some communities have booming economies, places like Boston, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, other Washington, D.C., other places, Akron, Toledo, Cleveland, Detroit, these places are struggling. So each community is different. And in each community, you're going to have to identify who are your key stakeholders. Certainly social justice groups are probably going to be on board across, but don't give the same message to each constituency. Each constituency has their own concern. One of the problems that people in our movement have is that we'll call a meeting for our reform, and we expect everybody to come and back our reform because we know it's good for them. But they don't know it's good for them, and they're not going to come to our meeting because they've got their concerns. And this means more work for us, but I think that the way to be successful is that we have to go to their meetings, talk in their language about why it's good for them, and then get them on that basis to get on board.
Yeah.
But again, each stakeholder group, each constituency, you're going to have to hone in on their concerns, their way of talking. When I would be put on the agenda for community meetings, I used to work for city government. I went and talked about parking taxes or parking fees and transit issues, all types of things. If I was put on a community meeting agenda, I would usually show up the meeting before, not to talk, but just to listen, to hear how they used language, to make sure that the words I used were the words that they would use, and that I didn't inadvertently use a word that was fine for me, but might trigger some bad reaction on their part. So it's very important that we listen to people, understand their issues, their concerns, and their way of talking about them, and then tailor our message so that it's understandable. And it's important to be clear. I'm not saying that we should talk out of both sides of our mouth. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that a single set of facts can be expressed in different ways to different constituencies, so they'll understand it.
Yeah, no, that's good. I did have one last thing before I give up the.
Well, tell you what, Marty, why don't we let others
Okay.
ask questions, and then we'll come back to you.
Okay,
Great, thank you.
good.
So the next one is Joseph.
Hi, Rick. My name is Joseph, and I am studying economics in graduate school, and my interest is Korean income inequality. And thank you so much for your presentation. I could fully appreciate that land value taxation is superior to property tax, but it's quite surprising and shocking that nowadays property taxation take over the land value taxation in most everywhere in this world, including Korea. My question is that nowadays we, like Hong Kong and Korea, most land is already fully developed, and there are not much land underdeveloped or empty, but it's literally it's really developed. So under these circumstances, still your argument, how can I convince people that still land value taxation is still powerful and superior, or is there any need for modification for your argument under this circumstances? That's the question.
Right. Well, as I've said, and I'll say it again, every community is unique, and every country is unique, and each one has to be analyzed individually based on its own characteristics and context. I have to confess that I know little or nothing about Korea in terms of economy or levels of development. What I do know is that Japan and Taiwan were kind of, well, particularly Taiwan was definitely a third world country prior to the exile of the Chiang Kai-shek regime from China. Sun Yat-sen, who was a very famous reformer in China, supported a land value return as a philosophy and was not able to implement it because the landlords in China opposed it. You know, they said, no, we're happy with our feudal landlord system where we collect all the rent, and we don't want to share that with the government or anybody. But when they lost to the communists and were exiled to Taiwan, all of a sudden they weren't the landowners in Taiwan, and they were happy to implement land value return in Taiwan. And they did so, and Taiwan all of a sudden became this industrial power.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, after World War II, a lot of Americans were part of the reconstruction of the Japanese government. And there were certain Americans who were fond of land value return, and they imposed the land value tax in Japan. Now, I don't know how Taiwan and Japan compare, but my hunch is there wasn't a lot of fallow land in Japan, you know, being a small country with a heavy population. But nonetheless, after a land tax was imposed there, Japan became a lot more productive. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that we talked about last week, I don't know if you were with us last week, we talked about the irrigation districts in California. So they put in irrigation districts, and initially they charged the farmers according to how much water they took out of the irrigation ditch. And what they found was that there were these large landowners whose value of land went way up because they had access to irrigation. But because they weren't using it, they weren't paying into the system. So they were getting money for nothing. And they could go to the bank, take out a loan based on the higher value of their land, and they could live high off the hog and could, you know, they were basically being parasites.
Oh.
When the law was changed to finance the irrigation system based on the land value uplift that was intensively. So maybe in Korea, all the land is being used, but maybe it could be used more intensively, either for farming or for development. And unless we analyze the data, we don't really know what's going on. But I do think that you could make the argument that even though there's not a lot of vacant land, that nonetheless, where this has been used, it has made the economy more vibrant, more productive, both in terms of agriculture and industry. And that might be appealing in your home country.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Ibrahima, who's next?
Gabriel.
Hi, Rick. Nice to see you again. Nick, is there any possibility that if you could kind of explain a little bit more, and this is something that you and I have talked, the ratio of between land and building, and how different neighborhoods, wealthy and thriving neighborhoods, will benefit compared to poor neighborhoods. That's one of the questions that I have. The other one I just wanted to make maybe is a good news, in the sense that currently in the Senate in Minnesota, there's a bill in the floor that is a bill for an act relating to taxation, property, authorizing cities to create land value taxation districts. And I guess, this? I'm sorry, in Minnesota.
Minnesota, okay.
Yes. So that's good news for many of us who are pushing something like this to go all over the state. And I share with everyone, and with Marty especially, because I think that land value taxation comes very relevant to the current crisis that we are living in the country. So the article is just how do we use land value tax to rebuild our cities and create more housing and create more equity. But the question is basically, if you could help me explaining a little bit more, maybe again, that issue of the ratio between land and building.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I should have a slide for this and I don't. But let's go to this slide here. And if you can see my cursor, I'm at the bottom sort of middle right, and I'm circling this figure, which is $639 million.
Correct.
$639 million was the annual revenue of the traditional property tax in 1991. So the idea of a revenue neutral shift, tax shift, is if the split rate tax is going to raise the same amount of money as the traditional tax, what would the rates be? Now, if we have only one property in the city, by definition, it's going to pay the same tax after the change as it did before, right?
Correct.
You're with me?
Yep, following you.
Right. So you say, well, if it's going to pay the same tax before and after, why do the change? Well, the purpose of the change is not to create tax increases or tax reductions. The purpose is to create better incentives for land stewardship going forward. So even though, as a result of this revenue neutral tax shift, this one property in this jurisdiction is paying exactly the same, the incentives are now different. Under the old system, it would be more expensive for them to replace the roof or put an addition on the house or make some other improvement. Whereas under this new system, it'll be cheaper to do so. So we're encouraging property improvement and maintenance, which is a good thing going forward. So first of all, I just want to make clear, the point of the reform is not to create tax reductions or tax increases. It's to create better incentives.
Yeah.
But it's also true that if you're going to make a change, it has to be politically palatable, particularly to homeowners, but to other taxpayers as well. So the question is, how do you do that? And again, you have to run the numbers. So we just said if there's only one property in the jurisdiction, by definition, it's going to pay the same tax before and after, by definition. But now let's say we have several properties in a jurisdiction, that's typical. So if a property has the average ratio of building value to land value, as is true for the jurisdiction as a whole, then this revenue neutral tax change is going to affect that property just like it affects the jurisdiction as a whole. In other words, that property that has the same building value to land value ratio as the whole jurisdiction will see no change. If the land value ratio is higher, in other words, there's more value in the building than in the land compared to the jurisdiction as a whole, shifting taxes off of building onto land means that property is going to see a tax reduction. So think of a high-rise building on a small lot. Typically, they're going to have more building to land value ratio than is typical for the jurisdiction. They're going to see a reduction in taxes. On the other hand, think of a boarded up building or a vacant lot or a surface parking lot. They're going to have much less in the building compared to land than the jurisdiction as a whole. So those properties will see tax increases. And, you know, it gets complicated because you don't always have those clear examples. For example, you may have a very expensive building, like a mall, but it's on a huge amount of land with acres and acres of surface parking. So unless you do the math, it's hard to know offhand, is it going to do well or poor or in between? In most cases, if you've got acres and acres of parking, you don't do as well as you might think, even if the building itself is very valuable, compared to, say, a small commercial building in a downtown that occupies all of its lot without any parking. And that gets back to sort of the strong town arguments that Chuck Marone makes, which is that on a per acre basis, a lot of your old downtowns are a lot more valuable than the shiny new malls that are built on the outskirts. But you basically have to do the math. You have to do each property case by case, each city case by case. Fortunately, with computers and spreadsheets, we can do that.
Great.
And I'm available to help if somebody needs help doing that.
Thank you, Rick.
Who's next, Ibrahima?
Let me, Hardin? I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Rick. Thank you so much for leading this class for us. It's been wonderful along the way.
Great.
My question is just if you could share, and maybe I missed a little bit last week, but if you could share some other examples where this has been implemented. And then the second question would be, do you do consulting work or jump in to help if somebody wanted to try something along these lines?
Yes, I do consulting work. And there are other people in addition to myself who do this type of work. I mentioned Josh Vincent earlier. He's done work on this. In terms of places that have done it successfully, perhaps the most dramatic example that we mentioned last week were the Pittsburgh. I mean, let's see. We talked about the irrigation district earlier, where they started applying land value tax. The irrigation district, the flood protection district on the Miami River, we just talked about that a few minutes ago. Those are rural examples. In terms of urban examples, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was tremendously successful. After 1972, Hurricane Agnes caused the Susquehanna River to flood. By the mid-1970s, there were over 5,000 vacant properties in downtown Harrisburg. They implemented this land value return system where they were taxing buildings much less than land. And over a period of about 15 years, the number of vacant properties went from over 5,000 to just a few hundred. And Harrisburg, which had been characterized in the 70s as one of the worst cities of its size in the country, was suddenly characterized as one of the most livable and best cities of its size. And this happened during the 1980s and early 1990s, long before the back to the city movement that we're now familiar with happened. So, what was the cause of it? Well, this tax system was the cause. Pittsburgh was tremendously successful using this tax system. They started using it in 1913. And they weathered the Great Depression better than other cities because they had this in place. And in spite of the fact that they had a booming industrial economy, most cities that have booming economies have unaffordable housing. I mean, it's interesting. You go to Silicon Valley, you've got a lot of people in households who are making six-figure incomes. In spite of that, they can hardly afford housing there. The thing that was interesting about Pittsburgh was even though they had a booming economy, lots of jobs, people making good union wages, housing was still very affordable in Pittsburgh. A lot of that is because of the fact that they discouraged land speculation through land value return. And perhaps most compelling was the case of three towns outside of Pittsburgh: Clairton, Duquesne, and McKeesport. They were three cities. They each had a steel plant shut down in the middle of town. And for 3 years, each of them had declining number and value of building permits. McKeesport implemented land value return. The other two cities did not. All of a sudden, development started going up in McKeesport. What happened in nearby Duquesne and Clairton? Development kept going down as it had before. When the folks in Clairton and Duquesne saw what was going on in McKeesport, they adopted land value return also, and then development started to uptick in their cities as well. So it's very rare in the social sciences that you get a controlled experiment. I think the case of McKeesport, Clairton, and Duquesne is about as close as you can get. And the evidence was very compelling. Also, I should mention that two professors, Oates and Schwab from the University of Maryland, did a study comparing Pittsburgh to other Rust Belt cities. And they found that Pittsburgh's land value return property tax system was largely responsible for the fact that Pittsburgh weathered the loss of manufacturing, which was substantial, much better than 15 other Rust Belt cities did. So there's I think, a wealth of evidence that shows that this is not just good theory, it actually works in practice. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Very good. So we have Dennis. Are you here, Dennis?
Yes, thank you. I had to find the mute button. Rick, thanks for getting back to this part of the discussion. I really appreciate it tonight. I have to admit, there was a lot of numbers for an architect to keep up with, especially on a late Thursday. So I was trying to capture or to follow the concepts when you were going through the hypotheticals to go from a current formation to LVRR basis. And I think I got the principles, in general of increasing the land value over the building value, and that sounds like a factor you could play with. Trying to keep residential below commercial, maybe improved. Well, vacant land then becomes similar to adjacent land values once you get those factored out, and improved land values. Whereas, and you can check back on any of those, but where I really lost it was, how did you factor in distance in terms of central city properties versus suburbs, or that distance factor, and how does all this play out over time? That whole question about avoiding sudden change.
Right. So basically, what I relied on, and I'm lucky, DC has or did at that time, had a fairly decent assessment system. And so I relied on the city assessments. I got, huge printouts from the city, which I had to, and my dad and I entered by hand into a Lotus spreadsheet. And basically, for each assessment neighborhood, we had the total land value and the total building value for each assessment neighborhood. And in each neighborhood, we had a list of properties. And in some cases, we saw numbers that didn't make sense. So we went back to the assessor's office and said, well, this just doesn't make sense. What's going on here? And we found some mistakes. But we relied on the city's assessments, and their assessments of land value. Of course, land value is a very complex amalgam of all the positive and negative things that affect a particular site. So being close to the center is typically a good thing, but there may be, let's say, a flight path or a sewage treatment plant or a trash transfer station or something that, even though you're in the center, that you've got this disamenity word that reduces that value. Well, we don't have to do any mental gymnastics. We just look at the market value, and the market tells us how the benefits and the disadvantages weigh out against each other. The market does that for us. So we just followed what the market does. And again, if you want to get sophisticated about it, you can use a CAMA system with a multiple regression analysis module, so that once you've determined, well, here's the total property value, and of that, this much is building, and this much is land, then you could break the building and land components down further. So let's say one building has gold faucets in the bathroom, and the other has brass. Your multiple regression analysis will tell you what the difference is, if any. In other words, obviously people will pay more in the at Lowe's or Home Depot for gold faucets, if it's real gold, than for brass. But will consumers pay more based on gold versus brass? The market will tell us. So, and the same, while the multiple regression analysis is typically done to, what's the impact of brick versus wood siding versus different types of roof versus fireplaces versus all kinds of stuff. You could do that same analysis, if you took the time to set it up, for within the land value, how much of that land value is related to schools? How much is it related to transportation? How much is it related, and water and sewer? And you could go on and on and on and slice it and dice it. So again, this is sort of assessment technique, which may be, I think, the subject for another course, not something that we have time to delve into here, but it is doable. Yeah, it is doable.
During the morning, probably would be a better time for that course.
Right, and the other thing too is that I should let you know that when we came out with this study, the city's assessment department came out with a competing study, which said that the land value return was going to increase taxes for homeowners. And Why was that? Well, what they said, the assessor's office, was
You are having problem with your audio, Rick, I
this
believe.
system of classification was incompatible.
We lost you, Rick.
Right now. Am I back?
Yes.
No.
Tell you what. Let me see if I can turn off my camera.
Yeah, that would be better. Okay.
Hi, sorry about that. I think
Fine.
I disconnected. Am I back now?
Yeah, and clearly, it's better.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Let me get back to, okay, so let me get back to where we were. We were talking about, oh yeah, about land classification and what the city did. So the city said that, sorry. The city said that land classification was incompatible with Henry George's philosophy. So they got rid of all these classes of property and they just applied one land rate and one building rate to every property in the city to raise the same revenue. And obviously, because class one benefits from the lowest tax rate, as a result of their hypothetical study, homeowner taxes increased enormously. But this wasn't because of land value return and recycling. What they were showing was the effect of eliminating the classification system. And I don't want to get into the particulars of it, but the assessor's office has a sort of vested interest in the status quo. They're opposed to land value return and recycling, primarily because it draws attention to assessments that they're not paying attention to. And so they wanted to put the kibosh on it. And so while any city could do this analysis, I would be reluctant to let them do it. And if somebody wanted to bring me in as a consultant, I would have the city do this, but under my supervision, because the city simply can't be trusted to give a fair comparison between the status quo and a change that they may or may not want. I don't know if that answers your question, Dennis.
Well, that part doesn't surprise me. The other question was about this phenomenon of time. You mentioned, sudden impact versus gradual.
Right.
And is that, initially there is a premium for vacant properties. You do have an impact on vacant properties, which is positive in terms of motivations. Is the time factor just let play out as properties continue to develop and cities evolve? Is that how time plays into it?
Well, the way time plays into it is that even going to these rates that you see here on the right, if we did that overnight, again, some people saw tax changes of, reductions of 20 or 30%. Some people, individuals, may have seen increases, especially if vacant properties, some increases of 35, 50%. Well, that's a lot to bear, and it's unfair. So if we say, well, this is our goal to get here, but we're going to get here over 5 years. And in the first 2 years, we're going to maybe reduce the building tax by a few pennies and increase the land tax by a few pennies. Well, essentially, that makes no difference to anybody. But if it's part of a plan that's well communicated and people see where this is going, then the people who own the vacant lots, the boarded up building, the surface parking lots, they say, wow, in 5 years, I'm going to be screwed. I better start getting income from my land so that when this happens, I'm in better shape. And so by phasing this in gradually, but sending a clear signal, we allow all property owners to take advantage of the new incentives. And you can avoid the problem of windfalls and wipeouts. And if after you phase it in, somebody has a wipeout, well, that's on them because they saw which way the wind was blowing and they decided to do nothing.
Thanks, Rick. This has been a great course, by the way.
Thank you so much. Ibrahima, who's next?
Ed Dodson.
Rick, really interesting as usual, thought-provoking as usual. And early on when you were discussing, I forget which one of our attendees, about Annapolis and the historic district, I was just thinking about how many historic districts in the United States and elsewhere are today, because of rising sea levels, in flood hazard areas. And what the possibility is of actually dismantling historic buildings and relocating them to higher ground. And it seems to me that if there is an interest in preserving those historic buildings, something like that is going to have to be done. And I wondered what you would think in terms of land use planning about relocating a lot of historically important buildings in this way.
Well, I think you've raised a very important question, and I'm just going to decline to answer it. I mean, again, that's a whole course in itself. There are lots of studies in this country and elsewhere about towns that were in floodplains where either the state or the federal government went in and said, you know, you guys are getting flooded every year. We're not going to keep providing disaster relief. You're going to have to relocate your town. And in some cases, this was done. There are places where they simply abandoned the old buildings and built new stuff, and then the other stuff just decayed or disappeared, or in cases of dams was inundated by a man-made lake. There are just a whole host of different types of approaches, but you certainly hit the nail on the head that rising sea levels are putting lots of places at risk. Most of our major cities are either on rivers or on near coasts, and climate change is a real problem. And if we don't avoid or slow down sea level rise, we have to find a way to accommodate ourselves to it. And that provides a host of engineering, political, and economic and social challenges. And again, that's just more than I can go into right now, but it's a very important and complex issue.
Thanks, Rick, for at least giving it a shot right now.
Yeah, it looks like Helen has a question. Are you still here, Helen?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead.
Hi, Rick. So I'm sorry, I did arrive a little bit late for this class, so I'm not sure if you were able to cover the question I had about the relationship between
community land.
Yeah, LVR, and then bridging to something which I still foresee as a part of this future on this planet, which is taking land out of the buy and sell economic model.
Right.
The transition to that kind of thinking, which is basically what it is. It turns everything upside down. But that's what this time is about. It's like what we're doing isn't working, and it isn't addressing the needs of the majority of people on the planet. So there's some just major rethinking that has to be done. And yet there's a very practical part of, bridging all of that and making sure that community land trusts, nature land trusts, agricultural land trusts. I mean, it's ridiculous. We built on so many places, which is just prime agricultural land. And we are, animals, and we need food to eat. And, we can sort of look at what we're doing, and a lot of it hasn't made sense. So I want to take a broader perspective, and I'm just wondering if you've got any, good relationships or insights into how we bridge to something that, in fact, might be possibly a whole new model, for land.
Right. Well, I think that philosophically, the philosophical basis for land value return and recycling and community land trusts is the same. The notion is that land, and by land I mean land and natural resources, belong to the whole community and not to any one individual. The challenge for a community land trust is that in order to establish itself and sort of remove land from the market, the land has to be purchased, and that's enormously expensive. What's kind of interesting is through land value return and recycling, as you gradually increase the amount of fees that people pay based on land value, you're reducing the windfall that people obtain from land ownership. And in a sense, that windfall or potential windfall has become the primary motivation for ownership and for the speculative market, which, as I mentioned, is parasitic and sort of is both a self-fulfilling and a self-defeating prophecy that helps create these boom and bust cycles that are terrible for most residents and for most businesses. So as you gradually increase the rate of land value return, the windfall to private landowners simply disappears. And in essence, through gradual tax reform, I think you can basically turn a whole jurisdiction into a land trust, if you will, where people have land title and land ownership, but are essentially paying rent to the community for the privilege of having exclusive use of their land. I'm not sure I would phrase it that way in most community or political meetings at this time, but that is a kind of a logical extension of where one could go with land value return. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I also know there are, because I connect with these people, and they some of them have actually large acreages that they've actually feel like there's some other different purpose, and they are actually willing to donate, all or part of that land.
Right.
And that's where I would actually hope, and there's a lot going on right now, just because, let's just take the Western context, baby boomers having been able to buy all this land, and then we've got next generations that can't own anything, and yet the only ones that are going to own anything are still the 10% of the planet, if they've got parents and they inherit something, and it's still
Right.
keeps everything in the 1% or the 10%, and it's just not going to work. Like, it can't work that way. So,
I
just wonder whether there's something where, and so some of these people, I think, in their, just because they are passing on and want to do something that's good, I feel that it is actually the perfect timing to put some large pieces of land and demonstrate what eco-spiritual, eco-villages actually look like, and living in alignment with the planet, and being, self-sufficient, smaller communities in terms of food and all the other essentials that people actually need to survive and actually thrive, because we don't need as much as we materially think that we need. And I wonder if there's some kind of combination, and it's just like how to practically bridge it is.
Yes, well, you've put your finger on a very, very important issue, which is that, ecologically, we're on a very unsustainable path. And obviously, by definition, that cannot be sustained, and it does threaten future generations. The thing that I would notice is that although land value return is, I think, a step in the right direction, it's not the only thing to do, and I'm sure you're familiar with this also. There are such things as conservation easements that are very important, that can be used to preserve areas in their natural states. And oftentimes conservation easements, in order to be politically and economically palatable, are accompanied by something called transferable development rights. So the current owner who gives up the right to develop their land can still be compensated for that sacrifice, if you will, by selling development rights to some other receiving area. And this requires coordination within and between jurisdictions, because you can't have a donating area unless you have a receiving area. But there are areas, for example, where land is zoned less intensively than it should be. And these could be receiving areas, and people would pay for the development rights, and that would compensate the people who are creating the conservation areas. So land value return and recycling, I think, is a tool in the toolbox, but it's not the only tool. Conservation easements, transferable development rights, I'm sure there's some other techniques as well, but you're really on to something very important, and every tool should be used.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Great course. Thank you very much for offering it.
Thank you for that great question.
Great. Yanis?
Yes. Hi, Rick. Thank you. I was kind of thinking that I should wait to study the numbers, but it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you are not monitoring land values as they are being created. In other words, you don't go to a location and monitor what improvements are being made, and then what rents are being made, subtract the two, and boom, that's your land value, and then you should be taxing that. And I think the advantage of doing it the way I'm suggesting is that actually you would bring the tenants that are paying the rent and are creating the land value, you would get them on our side, and they would negotiate with the landlords lower rents, which would be good for them, or they would be the ones voting for actually their rents to be used by the city or other governmental entities for I don't know, investments and whatever other uses they would wish. But to me, I think the natural thing, if my landlord knew that the extra rent he's charging me will be taken away from him, I think he would be more happy to negotiate and give it back to me, right? So eventually rents, naturally under the Georgia system, would go to zero. So, and then that would be the ideal society where it's absolute freedom and liberty, because nobody is allowing their property privilege to be used as a way to milk somebody's hard-earned production. What's your comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure I really understood what you said, but let me take a stab at it.
No,
right now, under the status quo, people who own land can profit from land in two ways. First, they could put up a factory or a residential building or a commercial building for shops and offices.
Right.
And they can try to get revenue from that investment. And they hope that the revenue from the investment exceeds the cost, and then they make a profit. That's a very risky thing to do, and it doesn't always work out. The other way they can make money from owning land is by doing nothing and allowing the work of the community around them to make their land more valuable, which often happens over time. Land values historically tend to rise. So without doing any work whatsoever, without making any contribution, a landowner is in a position to extract value created by others.
At the point of the sale. So at the point of the sale, they are charging the buyer rent, basically, because that's what the purchase of a certain property entails. You pay up front all the rent for the lifetime of that property. Then you may sell it, and then you may be the rent collector. But at the point of the sale, you have a very easy way to assess how much that rent is. So,
well, the rent is based on the revenue potential of the land.
No, that's not.
And the revenue potential of the land is reflected in the market value of the land. And that market value is now distorted, as I mentioned at our very first class, because people are hoarding land. So the amount of land that's available for development, particularly at places where development is most productive, near existing infrastructure, there's an artificial scarcity of land there. So that distorts the market. If people had to pay land value return so that they were not getting this windfall, they would either develop land according to its potential or sell to somebody who would. And this would bring down land prices and rents and mean that people would be paying in rent based on the value that the community was creating in the land, and that community created land value would go back to the community that created it.
I don't know if it's community. Rick, I have a big issue. I mean, we had another workshop again last week, and the issue of community and how is that demarcated is not very clear. So if I'm paying rent in Manhattan, okay, you are telling me you're going to take my high rent and you're going to give it to who? To somebody in the Bronx? Why? Well, what does this guy have to do with Manhattan? Nothing. So it's very difficult to demarcate community. And I think it's much more efficient to let the parties that engage in the transaction have a more clear and informed view of what is value that they are getting and what is value that's speculated. And trust me.
Well, I think that's an interesting idea. It's not one that I've explored, so I really can't comment on it. It might be interesting to have an email discussion about it, but I really can't comment any further. I think you've raised an interesting point.
Cool. All right, thank you.
Very good. So let's go to Michael. Are you still here, Michael?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, Michael.
All right, thank you, Ibrahim. So, Rick, thank you. Probably the most understandable thing I've heard, the most understandable discussion and teaching I've heard so far on land value capture. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
You did mention before, and let's look at that sheet that you have on the screen now, that there was one business that was untouchable that you couldn't put the new tax rate on, and I thought you mentioned garages or parking lots. Did I hear that right?
What I mentioned was when the city created their vacant property penalty tax. It included both vacant lots and unoccupied buildings. But they did not include surface parking lots in their definition of vacant land, which I think was a big mistake.
Well, you're absolutely right, because that's basically hidden speculation.
Exactly.
And that's all that is.
And that's why in my example, instead of charging $5 for class 5, I charged $3.29. Because first of all, I didn't get into the unoccupied buildings because that was impossible to understand. So I just said, we'll make it very simple. We'll just charge the penalty rate on vacant lots. And by vacant lots, I included surface parking. And there was an enormous amount of value in that because a lot of these were in the downtown. And so what you can see down here is under the existing tax system, these vacant lots were paying almost $38 million. Under the land value return, they were paying $58 million. So I almost doubled their tax. And that's how I was able to make the city come out whole while giving tax breaks to productive users, whether they were residential or commercial and industrial.
Right. So thank you for that. Just one quick question out of that too. You mentioned that you didn't trust the city to come up with their pricing categories. So how would you expect them? How would you expect to trust them to come up with the money and handle the money? Don't you think you should have like a public bank as well for that?
No, what I meant was that the assessors department and the tax policy office, they had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And therefore, they manipulated the tax rate study to show that land value return and recycling was bad for homeowners and impractical. They also claimed that it was impossible to differentiate land value from building value, which is kind of a strange argument coming from the assessor's office, whose job it is to do that.
No, understood, but also for this.
So that's what I did not trust them to do the analysis.
Right.
But ultimately, I do trust them to do assessments. I mean, one has to have an assessment appeals process to keep them honest. You need to have transparency in assessments. I mean, we could, and I'm sure the Henry George School has done entire courses on how to do accurate and fair assessments. And, you know, how you structure your assessor's office, the appeal structure, the training that you do, whether you rely on CAMA or some other system. There's a lot that goes into that. So I would trust them to do that subject to oversight and appeals. Okay. In terms of what happens to the money, and I think some other people have raised this question too. Giannis talked about, well, you're raising money in Manhattan and you're spending it in the Bronx. I mean, right now we're talking about returning publicly created land value to the community that created it. But how does that money get spent? Well, that's all, the whole budget process, that's another course. How does the city set its goals? How does it decide how much to spend for schools, how much to spend for water and sewer, how much to spend for mental health, all these types of things. I mean, that's a whole other process I can't even begin to get into. So,
okay. Well, thank you for that.
Okay. Ibrahima, I know we're past 8:30. I'd be happy to wrap up unless there are other people waiting to ask questions.
I guess we are good. I don't see any other questions.
Well, I did have something, if you would, Rick.
Okay. Quickly.
So a lot of your examples had to do with new infrastructure and how to come up with fees and such. But we all know that infrastructure requires operations and maintenance. So wouldn't it be great to have a tool that would be able to engage the public on the costs and the benefits of, you know, for example, healthcare or water or police? It kind of comes from the other direction, is that you're having engagement meetings with people who get the resources, and there's an opportunity for that give and take between the providers and the receivers.
I think that's a good point, Marty. And I know that in the District of Columbia and some other cities, mayors have instituted sort of participatory budgeting processes where they go out, have community meetings, and get citizens to prioritize what they want the city budget to be spent on. I'm in favor of that.
Yeah, I was just mentioning it because there is a ASTM practice on managing infrastructure of that sort.
Right.
So
yeah, you gave a very good presentation on that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Ibrahima, anybody else with their hand raised, or should I wrap up?
I guess that's all for tonight.
Great. Well, let me wrap up. And first of all, just thank everybody for spending 5 Thursday evenings with me. That's a big commitment, and I appreciate your interest. And I'll sum up by saying, why is land value return and recycling important? First of all, it's an overlooked source of infrastructure funding. As we mentioned, communities are giving tons of land value away to a few powerful owners and then complaining that they're broke. Well, that should be stopped. The next, we looked at the incentives that are associated with different ways of raising money. And what we discovered is that how we raise money for infrastructure is just as important as how much money we raise. And finally, land value return, by the way, raises infrastructure in a way that creates good incentives for land use and for productivity and affordable housing. And land value return and recycling is a tool that integrates infrastructure with land use, which is now missing in many of our communities. So land value return and recycling, it generates revenue, which is important to advance critical infrastructure investments and to achieve transportation and other infrastructure goals. It creates favorable land use incentives. It helps discourage sprawl and achieve other land use goals. It encourages reinvestment and discourages disinvestment. It increases job creation and retention, and enhances housing affordability, and it enhances the efficacy of zoning regulations. As we mentioned, next to a new transit stop, you might increase the zoning because you think, well, it's good to have a dense building next to the subway station. But in spite of that higher zoning, the landowner might, under today's system, just leave the land vacant or leave it as a surface parking lot. Land value return makes that much more difficult and thereby enhances the power of zoning. And finally, it makes the tax burden more equitable and fair. Infrastructure beneficiaries will pay taxes and fees in proportion to the benefits they receive. And the public will be more fairly compensated for the benefits it creates. And finally, because we allow infrastructure to become financially more self-sustaining, we can reduce taxes on production and labor and on those who do not benefit directly. So that concludes the course. And the one thing we did not get to tonight, but I do want people to think about, is I hope you've learned something new. And if you have, what are you going to do about it? One of the things I think that we've learned on TV is that being aware of injustice isn't enough. Feeling unhappy about injustice isn't enough. We have to do something to change things for the better. And that's true in terms of police policy, and it's also true in terms of tax policy. So what are you going to do, now that you have this new knowledge, to improve economic efficiency and fairness in your community? I hope you'll do something. If I can help, let me know. Thank you very much, Ibrahima, for giving me the opportunity to share this information. And thank you for your great questions and comments. It's been a real pleasure.
Same here, Rick. Thank you very much. And of course, if you think about what you can do, feel free to drop me an email. I'll be happy to convey them to Rick. Okay?
Again, thank you, Rick.
Two more announcements that I'd like to make for tonight before we close. We will meet again on Thursday because Ed Dodson is offering a seminar on Joseph Phelps. For those of you who are familiar with the Georgist movement, Phelps was basically the bank account behind the Georgist movement in its early days. He contributed a lot to the movement. Cities like Arden, Delaware, Fairhope in Alabama, I believe, all those came to being because of a good amount of effort on his part.
Am I mistaken, or was Mr. Phelps a soap manufacturer?
That's exactly him, the NAFTA soap guy. Yep.
He made a fortune selling soap.
Exactly, and he also he made some of it as a land speculator, but then he repented. So he came back. He became an advocate for social justice. The other information, many of you were with us on Monday when Alana was scheduled to give a course on economics for a post-COVID world. But due to a very bad disruption on the network, and I guess it was general because a lot of people told me they had the same problem, we could not hold it. But we are hoping to redo it again on Monday. So if you have not registered, please visit the website and do register. And we look forward to seeing you all. And I will send you the course evaluation form. And as I mentioned in the chat, if you'd like to make a donation so we can keep offering these free courses, please do visit the website henrygeorgeschool.org and donate. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Ibrahima.
Pleasure.
See ya, everybody.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Ibrahima. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.